You are 60 years old. You have no pension, no hospital, no glasses, no medication for the pain in your joints that has been worsening for 3 years. You cannot run. You cannot carry what you used to carry. Your teeth are worn down to almost nothing. And the group you depend on for survival moves constantly, hunts constantly, and cannot easily afford to slow down for anyone who cannot keep up. In most retellings of prehistoric life, old people simply do not appear. The story of early humans is almost always told as a story of young hunters and gatherers, of strength and speed and endurance. Old age, if it is mentioned at all, is described as rare, brutal, and short, a liability, something the group could not afford. The evidence tells a completely different story. And when you hear it, it might change not only how you think about your ancestors, it might change how you think about what makes us human in the first place. Let us start with the bones. For most of the 20th century, paleoanthropologists assumed that living past 40 or 50 was extraordinarily rare in the Paleolithic. Early death was the default. Old age was an exception so unusual as to be almost meaningless in evolutionary terms. Then, in 2004, anthropologist Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that reanalyzed fossil dentalware data across 4 major periods of human prehistory. What they found demolished the assumption. Starting roughly 30,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic, the ratio of older adults to younger adults in human populations increased dramatically. Kaspari and Lee called it the evolution of grandmothering. For the first time in the fossil record, old people appeared in significant numbers. Not as exceptions, as a pattern. But here is what makes this finding genuinely strange. 30,000 years ago is not when humans suddenly became capable of living longer. The biology was already there. What changed was something else, something cultural, something about how groups organized themselves and treated their oldest members that allowed more of them to survive. The presence of old people did not follow naturally from biology alone. It was, at least in part, a social achievement, and it had consequences that echo all the way to you. The grandmother hypothesis is one of the most debated and fascinating ideas in evolutionary anthropology. Its most prominent version was developed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, based partly on fieldwork among the Hadza of Tanzania. Hawkes and her colleagues observed something striking. Older Hadza women, past reproductive age, spent more time foraging than almost any other group. Not less. More. And the food they collected did not go primarily to themselves. It went to their grandchildren. The data showed that in groups with active grandmothers, child survival rates were measurably higher. Grandmothers provisioned weaned children while mothers were occupied with infants. They transferred knowledge. They managed camp. They remembered the location of water sources and food patches that had not been visited in years, some that younger adults had never seen at all. In other words, old people in prehistoric groups were not passengers. They were infrastructure. Now look at what the archaeological record shows about how these individuals were actually treated. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, one of the most discussed prehistoric individuals ever found was Shanidar I, a Neanderthal male whose skeleton dates to roughly 45,000 years ago. His bones tell a story that researchers have found remarkable for decades. His right arm had been so severely injured, likely from a crushing blow in early life, that it had atrophied almost completely. He was effectively one-armed. He also showed evidence of a healed skull fracture, probable blindness in one eye, and significant arthritis throughout his skeleton. He was estimated to have lived to between 30 and 45 years old, which for a Neanderthal represented advanced age. Here is the key question the skeleton raises. A one-armed, partially blind arthritic Neanderthal survived for years, possibly decades, with these disabilities in one of the harshest environments our genus has ever inhabited. He did not survive alone. Someone fed him, someone protected him, someone kept him alive long past the point where he could have sustained himself independently. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkaus, who has studied these remains extensively, argues that Shanidar I is direct evidence that Neanderthals extended care to individuals who could not fully contribute to group survival. That is not the behavior of a species optimizing purely for immediate utility. That is something closer to what we would call compassion, and Shanidar 1 is not unique. At Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, a site dated to approximately 1.77 million years ago, researchers found the skull of an early Homo individual who had lost all but one of their teeth long before death. The bone had completely resorbed around the empty sockets, meaning this individual had been toothless for years, possibly many years before dying. In a world of raw meat and hard plant foods, surviving for years without teeth does not happen by accident. Someone softened food, someone shared. So, what did daily life actually look like for an old person in a prehistoric group? Picture a camp of perhaps 20 to 30 people in what is now southern France, 15,000 years ago. Among them, 2 or 3 individuals past 50. Their role in the group has shifted. They no longer lead hunts, but they sit at the edge of the butchering area and know exactly how to extract marrow from bones in a way that younger hands have not yet learned. They remember the drought of 7 years ago, and where the group found water when the nearest source dried up, a memory that has not yet been needed, but will be. They make tools more precisely than almost anyone else in the group because their hands have done it 10,000 times. They tell stories at night. This is not a romantic invention. There is genuine archaeological and ethnographic evidence for the central role of older adults as knowledge transmitters in small-scale societies. Anthropologist Kim Sterelny, in his work on cultural learning and human evolution, has argued that the transmission of complex skills across generations was one of the key drivers of human cognitive development, and that this transmission depended critically on long-lived individuals who had accumulated enough experience to teach. Linguist and cognitive scientist Daniel Everett, in his fieldwork among the Pairaha of the Amazon, observed that the most respected individuals in the group were almost always those who had lived long enough to have experienced multiple cycles of ecological and social change. Not the strongest, not the fastest, the oldest. Here is the twist that tends to get overlooked. Old age in prehistory was not simply tolerated. In many contexts, it was actively valued. The information stored in an old person's memory was irreplaceable and could not be reconstructed from any other source. Lose that person, and you lost decades of accumulated ecological knowledge, social history, technical skill, and crisis memory. The group that kept its old people alive was, in a very real sense, the group that kept its library alive. And here is the modern mirror that should give you pause. We now live in a world where the accumulated knowledge of elders is often treated as obsolete, where the pace of technological change is held to render experience irrelevant, where old age is increasingly medicalized and isolated rather than integrated. The fastest growing demographic in many developed countries lives alone. The transfer of knowledge across generations, which was the central survival mechanism of our species for hundreds of thousands of years, has been largely severed. There is something worth sitting with in that gap. For the vast majority of human existence, the question was never what do we do with the old people. The question was how do we keep them alive long enough. Old age was the goal, not the problem. The accumulation of years was the accumulation of value. A society that could produce more old people was, by definition, a society that had solved harder problems of survival and cooperation than one that could not. The modern inversion of this, the treatment of old age as a burden rather than a resource, is not ancient, it is not natural, it is extraordinarily recent, and by the standards of our species' full history, it is a profound anomaly. Your ancestors kept their old people alive not merely out of sentiment, they kept them alive because they understood something that is easy to forget in a world of search engines and instant information. There are things that can only be known by someone who has lived long enough to have seen them happen. There is one more dimension to this that almost never makes it into the standard account of prehistoric old age, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. Old people in small-scale societies were not just knowledge repositories. They were frequently the most socially powerful individuals in the group. Not because of their physical strength, which had declined, but because of something that increases with age and cannot be faked or shortcut. Reputation, trust, the accumulated weight of having been right before. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, in his work on hunter-gatherer social dynamics published in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, found that in the vast majority of small-scale societies studied, The most influential decision makers were older individuals whose judgment had been tested over many years and found reliable. Not elders in a formal or hereditary sense. Simply people who had been around long enough to have demonstrated, repeatedly and under real conditions, that their assessments of danger and opportunity could be trusted. In a world without institutions, without written records, without contracts or credentials, the only currency of social power was demonstrated judgment over time. Old people had more of it than anyone else, and the group, which depended on good collective decisions for survival, rationally preferred to keep them alive. You are 60 years old. You have no pension, no hospital. You are worn and slow, and your joints ache. But in your head is something the rest of the group cannot replace. And they know it. And because they know it, you are still here.